On January 10th, 1475, in the frozen forests of Moldavia, 40,000 desperate Christians faced 120,000 of Islam's finest warriors in what should have been the most one-sided massacre in medieval history. The morning mist clung to ancient oak trees as Ottoman banners blackened the horizon like a plague of locusts. The mathematics of annihilation were simple: 3 Muslim soldiers for every Christian defender. Yet by sunset, the largest Ottoman army ever assembled for conquest would lie shattered in the snow, and Europe's fate would hang on the tactical genius of one man they called the Wolf Prince. Picture this: you're standing in the war council at Suceava Castle as intelligence reports arrive with terrifying regularity. Suleiman Pasha, Beyler Bey of Rumelia, has crossed the Danube with a force that defies comprehension. 120,000 mounted warriors, including 30,000 janissaries, the elite slave soldiers who had never known defeat. Their supply train alone stretches for 15 miles, evidence of Ottoman confidence in total conquest. Behind them marches the accumulated wealth of the empire, 200 cannons that had battered down the walls of Constantinople itself. Facing this apocalyptic vision stands Stephen III of Moldavia, a man history would remember as Stephen the Great. At 42, he had fought over 30 battles without a single defeat, but nothing in his experience compared to this. His entire principality could muster perhaps 40,000 men, including 16,000 professional soldiers and 24,000 peasant levies with more courage than training. The disparity wasn't just numerical, it was civilizational. The Ottoman Empire commanded resources that dwarfed Christian Europe. Suleiman's army drew warriors from 3 continents: Anatolian cavalry, who had crushed Byzantine resistance; Balkan infantry, hardened by constant warfare; Arab engineers who understood siegecraft like a deadly science. Their recent victories read like a catalogue of Christian catastrophes. Bosnia fell in 1463, its nobility scattered to the winds. Albania's heroic resistance had crumbled the previous year. Hungary's border fortresses emptied at news of Ottoman approach. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you about Stephen's impossible position. Moldavia stood alone. Poland, supposedly Christian ally, had negotiated secret treaties with the Ottomans. Hungary's Matthias Corvinus, despite his reputation as a crusader king, offered nothing but empty promises. The Holy Roman Emperor was distracted by Italian wars. Even the Pope's calls for a crusade had fallen on deaf ears across a Europe exhausted by decades of Turkish advance. Stephen received Suleiman's demand for submission on December the 28th, 1474. The terms were standard for Ottoman conquest: convert to Islam, accept vassal status, provide annual tribute of 40,000 gold ducats and 2,000 boys for janissary training. The alternative was total war against an empire that controlled territory from the gates of Vienna to the Indian Ocean. Winter itself seemed allied with the invaders. Temperatures plunged to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, turning rivers into highways for Ottoman advance. The frozen ground that should have slowed massive armies instead provided perfect conditions for rapid movement. Moldavian scouts reported the impossible sight of 120,000 men moving north like a steel avalanche, their breath creating clouds of mist that rose like smoke signals of approaching doom. As December turned to January, Stephen faced the decision that would define European history: flee to Poland and preserve his army, or stand against odds that violated every principle of military logic. The smart money said flight. The brave choice was annihilation. Yet somehow, impossibly, the Wolf Prince chose a third option that would shatter an empire's confidence and save Christian Europe from Islamic conquest. Stephen the Great stood in his war chamber at Suceava Castle, studying maps by candlelight, as reports arrived every hour with escalating horror. Each messenger brought news that made victory seem more impossible. Suleiman Pasha's advance had transformed from military campaign into systematic devastation. The Ottoman vanguard, 15,000 Sipahi cavalry, had crossed the Prut River on January the 2nd, burning everything within 30 miles of their advance. Behind them, the main force moved like a plague across the frozen landscape, consuming resources that had taken Moldavian peasants years to accumulate. But here's what made Stephen's situation truly desperate. This wasn't just about one battle. At 42, the Wolf Prince had spent 18 years transforming Moldavia from a weak buffer state into Eastern Europe's most effective military machine. Every victory against Polish raiders, Hungarian nobles, and Wallachian pretenders had been purchased with tactical brilliance that compensated for numerical inferiority. Now he faced an enemy that outnumbered him 3-1 and possessed military technology his forces couldn't match. The mathematics of logistics alone should have doomed any resistance. Feeding 120,000 men required 2,400 tons of grain daily, yet Suleiman's supply system functioned with terrifying efficiency. Ottoman quartermasters had perfected conquest through administration. Their baggage trains included portable forges, field hospitals, and engineering equipment that could construct siege works in frozen ground. While Stephen's 40,000 defenders struggled to maintain adequate food stores through winter, the invaders brought wealth enough to sustain a year-long campaign. Then everything changed when Stephen received intelligence that revealed the true scope of Ottoman ambition. This wasn't a punitive raid designed to extract tribute. Suleiman carried architectural plans for permanent fortifications, Islamic legal codes for governing Christian populations, and orders to establish Ottoman provincial administration. The empire intended to erase Moldavia entirely, transforming it into the Eyalet of Bogdan under direct Turkish rule. By January 5th, Stephen's most experienced commanders were openly advocating retreat. Prince Bogdan Lapușneanu, his eldest son and designated heir, argued for withdrawal to Polish territory, where they could reorganize and fight another day. Military logic supported this strategy. Preserving the core army meant preserving the state's future. Even medieval warfare recognized that dead heroes achieve nothing, while living commanders can rebuild. Yet Stephen understood something his advisors missed. Moldavia's survival depended not on preserving armies, but on proving that Ottoman expansion had limits. Every Christian state from Hungary to Poland watched this confrontation. If Moldavia fell without meaningful resistance, the psychological impact would trigger a cascade of submissions across Eastern Europe. Stephen wasn't just defending territory, he was defending the idea that Christian resistance remained possible. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about those 5 desperate days between January 5th and 10th. Stephen implemented a strategy so audacious it bordered on madness. Instead of defending static positions, he ordered total evacuation of the invasion route. Every granary emptied, every well poisoned, every bridge destroyed. Moldavian civilians fled north carrying whatever they could, leaving behind a wasteland that would starve any occupying force. The Scorched Earth campaign transformed geography into weaponry. Ottoman scouts reported advancing through a land of ghosts, where prosperous villages stood empty and livestock had vanished. This wasn't mere denial of resources. It was psychological warfare designed to unnerve an army accustomed to living off conquered territory. As January 9th dawned with temperatures reaching -15 degrees Fahrenheit, Stephen faced the ultimate test of leadership. His army had reached the carefully chosen battleground near Vaslui, where ancient forests and hidden marshes offered tactical advantages that might compensate for numerical inferiority. Tonight would be their last chance to rest before confronting an empire's wrath, with nothing but faith, fury, and the desperate genius of a prince who had never learned to surrender. On January 10th at dawn, Suleiman Pasha surveyed the battlefield with the confidence of a man who had never tasted defeat. From his command position on the ridge above Vaslui, the Ottoman general could see his magnificent army spread across the frozen plain like a steel ocean. 120,000 warriors in perfect formation, their weapons gleaming in the pale winter sunlight. The Janissary Corps, 30,000 strong, formed the center with their white felt caps and deadly discipline. To their left and right, Sipahi cavalry units stretched to the horizon, 40,000 mounted archers whose composite bows had broken every Christian army they'd faced. But here's where legend meets reality. Stephen the Great had spent those critical pre-dawn hours positioning his forces with surgical precision across terrain that appeared open but concealed deadly advantages. The Moldavian prince understood something that Suleiman's map-makers had missed. Those innocent-looking forests flanking the battlefield weren't decorative wilderness. They were tactical death traps, dense enough to break cavalry charges, and maze-like enough to confuse retreating infantry. The morning's first engagement began at 7 a.m. when Ottoman scouts probed Moldavian positions. What they discovered should have terrified any competent commander. Stephen's 16,000 professional soldiers had vanished into the landscape itself. Moldavian crossbowmen crouched behind earthworks that seemed to materialize from frozen ground. Infantry companies hid in forest corridors that allowed rapid movement while remaining invisible to Ottoman observers. This wasn't a traditional army awaiting battle. This was a predator preparing an ambush. Suleiman's reaction revealed the fatal flaw in Ottoman tactical thinking. Accustomed to overwhelming enemies through superior numbers and firepower, the empire's generals had never learned to fight opponents who refused conventional battle. When Moldavian forces melted away before advancing janissaries, Ottoman commanders interpreted retreat as weakness rather than strategy. By 9 a.m., confident Turkish infantry had penetrated 500 yards into what appeared to be abandoned defensive positions. Then everything changed. At precisely 10 a.m., as the main Ottoman assault reached maximum extension, Stephen triggered the first phase of his master plan. Moldavian forces that had seemed to flee suddenly emerged from concealed positions, cutting off Ottoman retreat routes. The empire's elite janissaries found themselves advancing into a funnel where their numerical superiority became irrelevant. Forest paths that could accommodate 3 men abreast transformed 30,000 disciplined infantry into confused clusters struggling through unfamiliar terrain. Here's what makes this moment truly extraordinary. Stephen wasn't just using terrain as a weapon. He was exploiting cultural blindness. Ottoman military doctrine, perfected across open battlefields from Anatolia to Egypt, assumed that superior numbers could overwhelm any defensive position. Turkish commanders had never encountered an enemy who treated forests as tactical allies rather than obstacles. When Moldavian archers began picking off janissary officers from tree-mounted positions, Ottoman response protocols simply didn't exist. The psychological impact on Turkish forces was immediate and devastating. Warriors who had conquered Constantinople and dominated Balkan battlefields suddenly faced an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't predict, and couldn't counter using traditional tactics. By 11 a.m., reports reached Suleiman that his advance units were taking casualties without inflicting damage. The legendary janissary discipline, maintained through decades of victory, began showing its first cracks. But Stephen had only revealed the opening movement of a symphony of destruction. Hidden in those same forests that were devouring Ottoman infantry, 8,000 Moldavian cavalry waited for the signal that would transform tactical advantage into strategic annihilation. The Wolf Prince understood that defeating 120,000 enemies required more than defensive brilliance. It demanded the kind of coordinated assault that would shatter an empire's confidence in a single afternoon. As noon approached and Ottoman confusion deepened, Stephen prepared to unleash hell itself upon forces that had never imagined defeat was possible. At precisely noon on January 10th, 1475, Stephen the Great raised his battle horn and unleashed the most devastating cavalry charge in medieval European history. From 3 separate forest positions, 8,000 Moldavian horsemen erupted simultaneously, their war cries echoing across the frozen battlefield like thunder from hell itself. The sound was indescribable, thousands of hooves pounding frozen earth, steel clashing against steel, voices screaming prayers in 3 languages as Christian fury met Islamic confidence in a collision that shook the ground for miles. The Ottoman center, already confused by forest fighting, had no time to reform. Suleiman Pasha watched in horror as his perfectly ordered battle lines disintegrated under coordinated assault from directions his scouts had sworn were impassable. The lead Moldavian wedge, 2,000 heavy cavalry, led by Stephen himself, struck the Janissary left flank with the force of an avalanche. In the first 30 seconds, 800 elite Turkish infantry simply ceased to exist, crushed under hooves or transfixed by 12-foot ash wood lances. But this wasn't random violence. This was choreographed destruction. As the main Moldavian charge carved through Ottoman ranks, secondary forces emerged from concealed positions to exploit the gaps. Prince Bogdan Lapușneanu led 1,500 cavalry against the Turkish right wing, while Moldavian infantry poured from the forest to prevent Ottoman retreat. Within minutes, Suleiman's 120,000-man army found itself fragmented into isolated pockets, each fighting separate battles against an enemy that seemed to multiply with every engagement. Here's what makes this moment truly extraordinary. The Ottomans weren't just losing. They were being systematically destroyed by forces they couldn't see coming. Moldavian tactics violated every principle of medieval warfare. Instead of one massive charge followed by withdrawal, Stephen had coordinated multiple simultaneous assaults designed to create maximum confusion. Turkish cavalry, attempting to respond to the crisis, discovered that forest paths they'd ignored were now occupied by Moldavian crossbowmen, who picked off officers with surgical precision. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Janissary units that had never retreated found themselves surrounded in terrain that negated their training. Ottoman cavalry, the empire's primary striking force, couldn't maneuver effectively in forest corridors designed for infantry combat. By 12:30 p.m., reports reaching Suleiman described not tactical setbacks, but complete unit annihilation. The 7th Janissary Orta, 500 men who had fought at the siege of Constantinople, was wiped out in 15 minutes of forest fighting. Then, everything collapsed at once. At 1 p.m., as Ottoman commanders desperately tried to organize defensive formations, Stephen triggered the final phase of his assault. Hidden reserves, 6,000 fresh infantry who had remained concealed throughout the morning's fighting, emerged from positions Ottoman scouts had never detected. The sight of Moldavian banners appearing from seemingly empty ground shattered the last Turkish morale. Elite Sipahi cavalry, seeing their infantry support crumbling, began edging backward despite their officers' frantic orders. The rout began with mathematics that defied military logic. Of the 30,000 Janissaries who had advanced that morning, fewer than 8,000 remained combat effective by 2 p.m. Ottoman casualties weren't just heavy, they were catastrophic. Bodies carpeted the forest floor in layers, the fallen creating obstacles for the living. Abandoned weapons littered the ground like iron seeds, evidence of warriors who had thrown away everything to run faster. Suleiman Pasha, watching his invincible army disintegrate, made a decision that would haunt him forever. At 2:15 p.m., as Moldavian cavalry closed on his command position, the Beylerbey of Rumelia abandoned his golden standard and fled on horseback toward the Danube. The sight of their supreme commander in retreat shattered the last Ottoman resistance. If Suleiman ran, what hope did common soldiers have against an enemy that fought like demons possessed? By 3 p.m., pursuit had become annihilation. Stephen's forces, their blood up, chased fleeing Ottomans through the same forests that had protected Moldavian preparations. The killing was methodical, efficient, terrible. In 6 hours of fighting, the largest Ottoman army ever assembled for European conquest had been reduced to scattered refugees, stumbling through frozen wilderness, leaving behind 45,000 dead and the shattered confidence of an empire that had considered itself invincible. As the winter sun set on January 10th, 1475, the frozen battlefield near Vaslui revealed scenes that would haunt chroniclers for centuries. Where Suleiman Pasha's magnificent army had stood that morning, only corpses remained scattered across 3 miles of blood-soaked snow. The numbers defied comprehension. 45,000 Ottoman dead carpeted the forest floor, their bodies creating grotesque bridges across streams that had frozen red with spilled blood. Another 35,000 lay wounded or captured, many of them elite janissaries who would never again terrorize Christian Europe with their legendary discipline. Stephen the Great, his armor dented and his sword blade chipped from 6 hours of personal combat, surveyed the carnage with emotions that mixed triumph with exhaustion. The Wolf Prince had achieved something military historians still struggle to explain. His 40,000 defenders had destroyed the largest invasion force in Ottoman history, while suffering fewer than 3,000 casualties. The mathematics were impossible, yet the evidence lay frozen in the January twilight. 3 Muslim soldiers dead for every Christian scratch. But here's what made the victory truly staggering. This wasn't just battlefield success. It was economic and military catastrophe for the Ottoman Empire. Suleiman's army had carried wealth sufficient to fund conquest for 2 years. Gold intended to pay 120,000 soldiers, weapons manufactured in the finest armories of Constantinople, horses bred in Anatolia's best stables, all of it now belonged to Moldavia. The immediate material gains included 200 cannons, enough artillery to fortify every Christian fortress from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The psychological impact struck even deeper than material losses. Ottoman military doctrine, refined through decades of victory from the gates of Vienna to the Indian Ocean, had proven worthless against an enemy who understood terrain better than tactics. Moldavian forest warfare had exposed fundamental weaknesses in Turkish strategy. Elite janissaries, trained from childhood to fight in open formations, became helpless when separated from their supporting units. Sipahi cavalry, the empire's primary striking force, discovered that composite bows meant nothing when targets remained invisible behind ancient oak trees. Picture the scene as Moldavian soldiers moved through the aftermath, collecting weapons and tending wounded enemies with surprising mercy. Stephen had ordered his men to treat captured Ottomans according to Christian principles, a decision that would enhance his reputation across Europe as a warrior who combined tactical brilliance with moral restraint. Turkish prisoners, expecting enslavement or execution, instead received medical treatment and eventual ransom negotiations. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about those crucial hours after victory. Stephen understood that defeating 120,000 enemies was meaningless unless the strategic implications reached Constantinople. By sunset, mounted messengers were racing toward every Christian capital in Europe, carrying news that would transform diplomatic calculations from London to Moscow. The Ottoman Empire, seemingly invincible since the fall of Constantinople, had revealed that it could be beaten by forces willing to fight with intelligence rather than desperation. The immediate consequences rippled across the Balkans faster than military dispatches. Hungarian border garrisons, preparing for inevitable Ottoman assault, suddenly found courage to resist Turkish demands. Polish nobles, who had secretly negotiated tribute agreements, began reconsidering their accommodations with Islamic power. Most importantly, the myth of Ottoman invincibility lay shattered in the frozen forests of Moldavia, buried beneath 45,000 corpses, who had believed conquest was their divine destiny. As darkness fell on January 10th, Stephen the Great knelt among his exhausted soldiers and led them in prayer. Te Deum Laudamus echoed across a battlefield where the impossible had become reality. The Wolf Prince had proven that faith, terrain knowledge, and tactical genius could overcome odds that violated every principle of medieval warfare. Tomorrow would bring diplomatic recognition, papal blessings, and European celebration. Tonight belonged to 40,000 men who had saved Christian civilization by refusing to accept that mathematics determined destiny. In 6 hours of fighting, they had changed the course of European history and proven that sometimes, just sometimes, courage counts more than counting. News of the Battle of Vaslui reached Constantinople on January 18th, 8 days after Suleiman Pasha's shattered remnants straggled across the Danube with tales that sounded like fever dreams. Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople and terror of Christian Europe, received the reports with disbelief that slowly transformed into rage. The empire that had expanded relentlessly for 2 centuries had suffered its most catastrophic defeat at the hands of a principality most Ottoman officials couldn't locate on a map. The psychological shockwave rippled through every level of Turkish society, from palace bureaucrats to frontier raiders who suddenly questioned whether Allah truly favored Islamic conquest. The strategic consequences unfolded with devastating precision across the next decade. Hungarian resistance, previously crumbling under Ottoman pressure, stiffened into effective opposition that delayed Turkish expansion by 20 years. Polish nobles abandoned their secret accommodations with Islamic power, instead forming military alliances that would prove crucial in future conflicts. Most significantly, the myth of Janissary invincibility lay buried in Moldavian forests, encouraging Christian resistance from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. Pope Sixtus IV's reaction revealed the victory's broader significance. On February 14, 1475, papal bulls declared Stephen III athlete of Christ and granted indulgences to any Christian who supported Moldavian defense. This wasn't mere religious theater. Vatican recognition transformed a regional conflict into a crusading cause that attracted military volunteers and financial support from across Catholic Europe. Stephen's tactical genius had achieved something decades of papal diplomacy couldn't, uniting fractured Christian states against Ottoman expansion. But here's what makes the legacy truly extraordinary. Military academies from St. Cyr to West Point still study Vaslui as the definitive example of terrain warfare overwhelming numerical superiority. Stephen's integration of forest fighting with coordinated cavalry assault became the template for asymmetric warfare that influenced everything from Napoleonic campaigns to modern insurgency tactics. The Wolf Prince had proven that superior numbers mean nothing when facing enemies who understand their environment better than their opponents understand warfare itself. The Ottoman response confirmed the victory's strategic importance. Mehmed II, recognizing that Balkan expansion had reached its limits, redirected imperial resources toward Anatolian consolidation and naval warfare in the Mediterranean. The empire that had seemed destined to conquer Vienna and threaten the Rhine instead spent the next generation rebuilding confidence shattered in 6 hours of forest fighting. Turkish expansion into Europe effectively ended at the gates of Moldavia, buried beneath 45,000 corpses who had believed conquest was inevitable. Stephen the Great continued his impossible reign for another 29 years, winning 47 battles while losing only 2 minor engagements. European courts that had ignored Moldavian appeals for assistance suddenly competed for alliance with the prince, who had achieved the unthinkable. When Stephen died in 1504, Ottoman chroniclers recorded the event with relief, noting that the great enemy of Islam had finally succumbed to mortality rather than Turkish steel. Yet the deeper significance transcends military history. Vaslui proved that technological superiority, numerical advantage, and imperial confidence mean nothing when confronting leaders who combine tactical brilliance with absolute commitment to impossible causes. Stephen understood something that modern strategists often forget. Battles aren't won by the largest armies, but by the most determined minds, willing to exploit every available advantage. The Battle of Vaslui stands as history's most complete vindication of intelligence over force, preparation over improvisation, local knowledge over imperial arrogance. On January 10, 1475, in the frozen forests of Moldavia, 40,000 desperate Christians faced 120,000 of Islam's finest warriors in what should have been the most one-sided massacre in medieval history. Instead, The Wolf Prince achieved mathematical impossibility through tactical perfection, proving that sometimes, just sometimes, courage and cunning count more than counting. In 6 hours of fighting, Stephen the Great had saved Christian Europe by demonstrating that even empires have limits when they encounter leaders who refuse to accept that defeat is inevitable.